Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. And from Writer's Block and the World Affairs Council, Andrea Grossman and I welcome you all to this very special program, Dinners with Ruth, featuring Nina Totenberg and moderator Jessica Levinson. Andrea, the World Affairs Council is so pleased to be partnering with you yet again. We always have so much fun together. I will now turn the program over to Andrea, and she will make the introduction. So enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Please turn your cell phones off right now, and we ask that you keep your masks on during the program. We all appreciate that. Thanks so much, and by the way, it's afternoon, Kim, it's not evening yet. Thanks so much to Kim McCleary and her great staff at the LA World Affairs Council, and enormous thanks to KPCC and to LAist for their invaluable media sponsorship. Thank you all so much for coming out today to see Nina Totenberg and Jessica Levinson discuss Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Nina's work covering the Supreme Court, and breaking stories that have reverberated for decades upon decades. We've relied on Nina Totenberg for over 45 years on NPR as she's patiently explained often tense Supreme Court hearings, reported on sometimes raucous judicial confirmation hearings, and explained to us the nuances of complex and controversial Supreme Court decisions. Not that there have been any of those lately. In her wonderful new book, Dinners with Ruth, Nina recounts some of her scoops before and during her time at NPR, and those stories alone are worth the read. Read about her coverage of employees at the Supreme Court and what they were expected to do for their bosses, the justices. In her niche covering legal affairs and hearings, she's broken scoop after scoop about justices and nominees. It was Nina who broke the story of Anita Hill's sexual harassment by Clarence Thomas, a story which guaranteed her a special spot in American feminist iconography stemming from that bombshell reporting. But there's so much more. It's really about her relationships in and around Washington, her marriages and her close friendships with her NPR colleagues. And through it all, she weaves the impact, the wisdom and wit of Ruth Bader Ginsburg imparted to her for 50 years. The stories in Dinners with Ruth illustrate a profound relationship that clearly carried both Nina and Justice Ginsburg through the best and worst parts of their lives for over 4 decades. Dinners with Ruth is a most moving account of the bond between Nina and one of America's most notable women. As if Jessica Levinson didn't have enough to do, she's jumped at the opportunity to moderate today's program with Nina. Besides being a brilliant and dedicated court observer, Jessica Levinson is a professor at Loyola Law School, where her teaching focuses on the Supreme Court, constitutional law, and election law. She's also the director of Loyola's Public Service Institute, and most pertinent for today, she's director of Loyola's Journalist Law School, which educates reporters who cover the law. She's a CBS News legal analyst, a columnist for MSNBC, and has a weekly legal segment on NPR member station KCRW. And she's host of the Passing Judgment podcast. And she's also the past president of the LA Ethics Commission. So here's what's going to happen today. Nina and Jessica will chat, and when they're through, you can ask questions, please, using the mics in the aisles at the front here. When you do ask questions, no speeches, please, just questions, and keep them brief. It's my pleasure to introduce Nina Totenberg and Jessica Levinson.
It works. I have the remnants of a cold. Don't worry, it's not COVID.
We chatted backstage and we decided we're going to do a little pre-game of the Grammys instead. So I'm sorry if you. The book was fine, but you've talked about it a lot.
It's fine. We're going to do the Grammys.
I don't say this lightly, but I thought the book, as I said to you, I really thought it was phenomenal, and I thought it laid bare a lot of truth about friendships, and particularly female friendships. And I thought maybe we'd start with the title, because it is about so much more than Dinners with Ruth, who I will call Justice Ginsburg. For me, it really is a memoir on the power of friendships.
Which is the subtitle. So when a publisher pays you a great deal of money to write a book and offers you a reasonable title, you say yes. And when you have something else you want it to be, then that's the subtitle.
I think we will start with talking about your friendship with Justice Ginsburg, because I know so many people do want to hear about that. And it is one of the, I think, truly special female friendships that you talk about in the book. And a lot of people may know how you initially met, which is over the phone. And she wrote a groundbreaking brief for the Supreme Court that essentially argued that under the 14th Amendment, women are included. Women are people. And I didn't expect a pause there, but yes, that is true. But Nina, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the first time you met in person, because that first call was professional. You called her as a young reporter and said, could you talk to me about why women are included, why gender discrimination is included? But the in-person meeting, I think, is a wonderful story.
Well, the time when I finally met her in person was, I don't know if it was a year later, or that year itself, or 2 years later. I really am not sure. But I had gotten used to calling her fairly regularly as she began litigating in the courts for women's rights. And I would call her up, and I would get explanations and information, and she then moved from Rutgers, where she was when I first talked to her, to later to Columbia. But when I first met her, it was some conference, some deadly conference, absolutely deadly conference. And we never really agreed on what it was about. But she did something very un-Ruthian at that conference. I said to her, I think I'm going to leave. And she said, I'll go with you. And we went shopping. And the truth is, I don't remember what, if anything, we bought or where we went. The only thing I remember is that it was a fairly long cab ride where I got to know her pretty well over the course of probably a 45-minute cab ride where we were stuck in traffic.
And one of the things that I love about when you first met, was that a louder, is...
So just here, put it close to your face.
Thank you. From you, I will absolutely accept that. When you and Justice Ginsburg met, and this seems to be part of one of the themes of the book, you met before you were public figures.
Right.
And I wondered when you were talking about, she said, great, I'll come with you. You went shopping with somebody who was a very smart legal scholar, but she wasn't RBG at the time.
No.
And you were a great reporter, but you weren't the dean of...
I was in my 20s. She was at least in her mid-30s, maybe even late-ish 30s. But neither of us were household names in any way, shape, or form. And we both had the experience of having our professional noses up against the window pane and essentially looking into a room full of men and saying to them, come on, let us in. This is work we can do too. And I think that was the basis of our early friendship. I mean, she was definitely the dominant figure in those early years, and probably forever, because I would never hold myself out to be even half as smart as RBG. But we had this shared experience that I had with other women as well. I mean, when I walked into the doors of NPR, it was the first time there were lots of other women there. Every other place I had ever worked up until then, I was either the only woman or one of two women. And when I walked into NPR, and most of the reporters were women, and it was a very small organization in those early days, but 3/4 of us were women. And the reason was no men would work for the money they were paying us. But those women, Linda Wertheimer and Susan Stamberg, and then Cokie Roberts, who I helped bring into NPR, she was just coming back from Greece with her husband, and her husband called me and said, I understand that there might be a job for my wife at NPR. And I said, bring her resume over to me, and I'll meet you on the ground floor. And I brought it upstairs, and Linda Wertheimer said, that's Cokie Boggs. I went to college with her. I was a year ahead of her in college. And so Cokie and Linda and I and Susan Stamberg, but particularly Cokie and Linda, we sat together for years and years and years. And we knew every aspect of each other's lives. And those women were my rock when things went wrong, when my husband fell on the ice and sustained a serious head injury, and for 5 years was in precarious condition from time to time until he died. And then after his death, they were my rock. And I like to think that I'm their rock and was their rock when they needed me. But I think the two of them in particular taught me really how to be a great friend.
You brought us to NPR and walking into that room, and as you mentioned, for the first time, not being the only woman in this room where people are professionals. And one of the things that I think the book talks about is the idea of this old girls network, and the idea that we tend to think sometimes, I think without nuance, that when women work together and women think there are only so many seats at the table that they will be competitive with each other. And as you mentioned, and as you talk about throughout the book, it was the opposite of that at NPR. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us, because I loved this phrase, a little bit about the fallopian jungle.
So that's what the guys used to call where we sat. We sat together, and they referred to it as the fallopian jungle, which probably today would get them fired. And in my view, it would be wrongly fired. I mean, they were being smartasses. Okay, I can live with smartasses. There are a lot of things I can't live with. But in the end, they understood that we actually dominated the newsroom, that we were better reporters for the most part than they were, that we were tougher and worked longer and harder, and that we could find out things that they sometimes couldn't find out, that we had strengths they didn't have. And, you know, Cokie's view and Linda's view always was that we never felt that that women discriminated against us because they wanted to be the only one or one of two or three. They always felt, and I think I always felt too, that we just worked more collegially in general than men. That when we got together on a story, that the object was to get the story, not to shine a light on one or the other of us in particular. We would all benefit if we could all get the story. I have to say that I think that that is the best part of a newsroom for men and women, or women and men, and that men understand that for the most part as well. And when they don't at their peril. Somebody will, that's a way to get beaten on a story, is to not work with other people, work and play well with other people.
In addition to the cooperative work, do you think some of those early friendships at NPR, and as you mentioned with Justice Ginsburg, I think you just used the phrase that you were both on the outside saying, "Men, let me in." How much of those friendships do you think were formed by being the outsiders, but the outsiders who faced just pervasive adversity based on your gender?
Well, we did feel like outsiders, and that was our bond. I think we were so used to it being that way that we sort of naturally understood that this was the best way to proceed was as a group. It's hard to put yourself back in time and know what would have been like if it had been different. It wasn't different. You know, we weren't there to break a glass ceiling. We were there to get a foot in the door. And then once you get a foot in the door, then you get another foot in the door. Then you bring somebody in with you. Ruth always said that, you know, she used to, you know, people would say, how many women do you think there ought to be on the Supreme Court? And she would say 9. I don't think she really meant that, but it is true that you need people who have similar experiences to your experiences in order to make it work. And I think that's what she really meant. I mean, she served on the Supreme Court for several years after Justice O'Connor retired, where she was the only woman. And she really hated that. She hated being the only woman.
And I think what you write about in the book is that Justice O'Connor was very happy to see Justice Ginsburg and to not be the only woman as well.
Oh, my God. Justice O'Connor was on the court for 12 years as the only woman. The day she walked in, I guess it was that she had to go back to chambers to go to the bathroom because there was only a bathroom for men in the robing room at the court. And when Ruth was named to the court, they finally figured out they'd better have another bathroom for the women justices on the court. I mean, that is a sort of, you look back and you think, how could they have been so stupid? But, privilege is assumed for a very long time before suddenly people wake up to the idea that other people have the same needs in different clothes, so to speak.
It will perhaps surprise you to know that I have a whole section on bathrooms in my notes, because actually I think they play a large role, which is when Justice Ginsburg went to college, that was where she studied, and you talk about that. She had a dorm room, there were classrooms. Why was she in the bathroom?
She never put it this way, but it was pretty clear to me what the reason was. As she often said, the ratio of men to women at Cornell was something like 3 or 4 to 1, and the view of parents who sent their daughters to Cornell was if you couldn't get a man at Cornell, well, forget it, you weren't going to get one. But I think that she studied and I don't remember, it's in the book, but I don't remember she had favorite bathrooms that she liked studying, and I think it was, I really don't remember. I think the reason that she liked studying in the bathrooms was that when she went back to the dorm, she could be one of the gang and not a brainiac, not somebody who was a grind. And she wanted to be accepted and be like everybody else. And she didn't want to be somebody who, I just happened, as I was getting dressed this morning, we were staying with friends, and my husband turned on the TV and he said, "You won't believe it. This is the original Beaver. Leave It to Beaver." Like, Beaver is like in second grade in this episode. And we watched this episode together. And in this episode, Beaver gets the highest score on the IQ test in the school, and his father is so proud that he starts telling the guy who's always noodling him about this or that or the other thing. And Beaver is not particularly happy because his friends don't want to be his friends because he's the smartest kid, and they don't want to be friends with the smartest kid because the smartest kid makes them look stupid. And of course, in the end, it turns out another kid switched the papers, and Beaver doesn't have to go to the private school for geniuses, and he gets his friends back, and everything's happy. Well, as you asked me this question, I think that Ruth did not want to be the smartest kid in the class, like Beaver. And she wanted to have friends and have a life in college like everybody else. And her way of dealing with that was not to go to the library and hang out there all the time. It was to disappear.
I wish I had a Leave It to Beaver follow-up at this point. You ended up doing some important work, as you talk about, at big events in the beginning of your career, where you would run back to the ladies' restroom and you would take notes. And I thought about these two ladies' room experiences. And could you tell us why, you're at these fancy parties, you're at the beginning of your career, and you're running back to the bathroom?
Well, I would go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which wasn't just for White House correspondents. Of course, it was a correspondents' dinner. But in those days, there were probably a half dozen women in a room of over 1,000 reporters. And it wasn't like the correspondence dinners of today where you bring in lots of Hollywood people. You brought in newsmakers with you. So the big get of one of the years that I was there, this is really classic, was Jimmy Hoffa. But these are huge dinners. And then afterwards, in those days, the networks used to have these big parties where they had a lot of very fancy food, and then the newspapers had smaller parties in which they had mainly liquor. The liquor flowed everywhere. And so I am one of, as I said, probably a half dozen women in the room at these dinners, and I was probably the youngest. All the others were, there were a couple of people who worked for the networks, like probably Nancy Dickerson, and there were a few old hags, as they were probably viewed, like Sarah McClendon, who was a very tough old reporter, but she worked for herself. Or May Craig, who worked for a Maine newspaper. And President Kennedy famously used to call on one or the other of them, sort of for what he viewed as comic relief, I think. So here I am, and I'm what I now recognize, but fortunately did not entirely recognize at the time. I was a very pretty young woman. And so I would wear what you wear when you're a pretty young woman, a sort of a low-cut evening gown. And I would encounter lots of, or by midnight, quite drunk men. And they knew a lot of stuff, and they spilled their guts. And I didn't care whether it was a cabinet secretary or whatever. As soon as about every half hour, I would, or whenever I found out something really good, I would go in the ladies' room, and I had a little teeny notebook in my pocketbook, and I would write notes, and then I would return to the field and get some more stuff. And I broke a lot of stories that way.
I just love that. But that brings up something else that you mentioned a number of times in the book, which is the unwanted advances by male colleagues, by male politicians. You mentioned being catcalled, and I thought you had some really brilliant strategies. And let's, of course, remind people, this was a time when you don't expect the law to protect you, as I think
there
you mentioned
wasn't any
explicitly.
protection. First of all, I mean, the Civil Rights Act had it been enacted, but women were thrown, sex discrimination was thrown in as a poison pill to kill the bill. And it had to, the sponsors of the bill had to just hunker down and get it passed with the poison pill. So there were no HR departments you could or would go to. They weren't HR departments in those days, I don't think, for all practical purposes. And you certainly wouldn't go to your boss, because half the time your boss was probably making a pass at you and you were trying to figure out a way around that. You had to have strategies. So my strategy was with members of the House and Senate, who I covered a lot. In those days, they would come out. If you would send in a note saying, would you come out and talk to me for a few minutes? And they would come out, and they would talk to you. And if you were a girl, which is certainly what I was, in addition to a woman, they would more often come out to talk to me, I think. Or a lot of times they came and talked to men reporters they knew, liked, and trusted. In my case, they probably came out just to sort of see me. And a lot of times they did say things that were sort of, you couldn't imagine them saying to a guy who was actually talking to them for a news story. For instance, I once was doing a story about a new route that had been awarded to Northwest Airlines to the Orient. And the initial flight, on the initial flight had been the members of the House and Senate Commerce Committees that oversee airline regulation and the awarding of these kinds of what were then exclusive routes. And so I was doing a story about whether that was an appropriate thing for them to have done, to have gone on these trips. And I called out Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader, and Mike Mansfield was a very upstanding, wonderful guy. And I said to him, "You didn't go on this trip." "Nope." And I said, "Why didn't you go on the trip?" "Don't do that sort of thing." That didn't get me much. So then by the end, the only other person that was on the committee that didn't go was the Republican senator from New Hampshire named Norris Cotton. And he came out to talk to me, and I said, "Senator, you didn't go on this trip. Why didn't you go on the trip?" And he said, "Oriental food gives me the trots." And that was the subhead on the story. But in terms of avoiding, I had there was a senator who was a wonderful source for me. He knew a lot of stuff. He was willing to share it with me. But I could see one day that we were getting very close to the point where he was going to make a pass at me. And I did not want that to happen, because if he made a pass at me, it would be very uncomfortable, and then I wouldn't be able to go to him to confirm stories or to ask him about stuff. So I didn't want to come to that. So I said to him, he said something, and I laughed, and I said, "Oh, Senator, you remind me so much of my father." Died on the vine.
I think it's a brilliant strategy. I want to stay with those early years of reporting for a moment, because there was a story that you pitched about obtaining contraception in Massachusetts. And I thought that the story said so much about that time, and bringing back, we're probably going to have those stories again. Could you talk a little bit about, and I loved leading into this in the book, you said there were moments where you had to prove your mettle. And you talk about that when you started in that job and then in NPR. But could you talk to us about coming up with that idea and what happened when you pitched that story?
Well, I was working on the women's page of the old Record American, otherwise known as the Record. And this was, this is not the women's page of today that has a lot of interesting stories. It was recipes and rewritten fashion press releases. So I was always looking for ways to do real reporting. And so I was in my early 20s, and contraception was illegal in the state of Massachusetts. It was before the Supreme Court ruled in the Griswold case that states couldn't outlaw contraception. In that case, it was just for married couples. But it was illegal in Massachusetts. Now, I'm sure that it was before the pill became very big. I'm sure that there were prescriptions for diaphragms and that sort of thing. But if you were a young woman in college, getting contraception was nigh unto impossible, except that, in fact, it was available at all the college health services. And I knew that. So I made an appointment at Harvard, at Simmons, at Wellesley, at a half dozen college health systems, overtly to get contraception. And I wrote this all up because it was, in my view, outrageous that the state legislatures still kept this contraception illegal. But there was a double standard. For women who had an education, they could get contraception. Everybody else, what were they going to do? So I wrote this up in a memorandum, and I gave it to the executive editor of the Record American, a lovely guy named Eddie Holland, who read my memo, called me into his office, and said to me, "Nina, I can't let you do this." I said, "Why not?" He said, I was about 21 at the time. He said, "Are you a virgin?" I realize this sounds a little crazy today, but I said, "Yeah." And he said, "And have you ever had an internal examination?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I can't let you do this." And I argued with him, and he absolutely was not having it. And I've often wondered why he thought he was protecting me, I think. Either that, or he didn't want to expose all of the academic institutions as having a privilege that nobody else in the city had. But it was, I think, indicative of the times that sex was so little discussed and so little, and the standards for men and women were so different that he couldn't, even in the name of a really good story, let me go ahead with something really pretty elementary in terms of, quote, investigative reporting.
I want to stay with journalism for a little bit, but moving on from those early experiences you had, writing down the big scoops in the women's ladies' room, and in the ladies' room, and in pitching what I think was a really important story at the time and move us into, I think, bigger questions about journalism and whether it's problematic, kind of neutral, or even beneficial to get to know the people that you cover. Because obviously, I think one of the delights of the book is that you know a lot of these public figures in the book, that Justice Ginsburg was at your house, I think you said 23 times in a row during the pandemic and towards the end of her life. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about something you mentioned in the book, the difference between objectivity and fairness. And I thought this was just a phenomenal point that allows you to cover the people that you know well and maybe even be better at it.
Well, first of all, let me say that the folks at the Poynter Institute who like to talk about journalistic ethics and see conflicts of interest in reporters who cover people they know and are even friends with, when they were reporters, they all had friends that they were covering. Because that's what you do when you're a reporter. They don't give stories to people and help people with stories that they don't like. Excuse me, this is not the real world. But from the reporter's point of view, knowing people that you cover and liking them even does not mean that you probably can't be, quote, objective about them because you like them. But that doesn't mean you can't report adverse information about them or adverse opinions about them. I mean, that's the nature of a good story, is you should read a good story that is, and not every story has to be like, oh dear, 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 that's just so terrible. It should be that it has two sides to it that make it difficult to decide what you think. That's the whole idea of fairness in reporting a story is. It often is not just with one side having the overwhelming right. And when you cover a Supreme Court justice, for example, the rules are much clearer than when you cover a politician. When you cover a politician, you're each trying to use each other for different reasons. They want to get their story out, their views out. You want to make sure you get at least an interview with them or information from them. And in the process, you get to know some of these people, and frankly, you detest some of them, and you like others. And this does not necessarily have anything to do with their ideological views. It is often in spite of their ideological views. There are, you can imagine that. That's the way it used to be when I first covered Congress, until I would say certainly the 2000s. That lots of people in the House and Senate had friends they didn't agree with on many things, if not most things. That is less and less true today. And I think Washington is much the poorer for it. The country's much the poorer for it. But when you are dealing with a Supreme Court justice, the lines are fairly clear. You can't say to them, so tell me what happened in the conference this week. If you were to ask a question like that, that person would not talk to you and would not consider you a friend. But you can get to know them. And when you get to know them, you know what experiences in their lives have been especially important. You know a bit about what makes them tick. And it enriches your knowledge of them as individuals, and it enriches the stories that you write for the people who are reading them and listening to them.
And you talk explicitly about times where you navigated your friendship with Justice Ginsburg and your role as NPR's legal reporter. And I would love for you to tell us the story of getting a call, but right before you were going on television, I think, from the ICU. I'm going to refer to it as the consommé story. And to me, it explains how the two of you were able to navigate a very real friendship while also having very demanding jobs.
Well, first of all, one of the interesting aspects of my friendship with Justice Ginsburg is that my husband is a trauma surgeon. He's also a really good doctor. And unlike some surgeons, who are great surgeons but not great doctors, but he's a great doctor and surgeon. And he and Ruth developed a very close relationship in which he was sort of her medical consigliere. And I could play no role in this, obviously, because I'm not supposed to know about the health travails or anything of a Supreme Court justice when I'm covering her, and some aspects of covering of her involve, ultimately, in the last couple of years of her life, her health. So about, I think, 2.5 or maybe 3 years before Ruth died, she died in 2020, so this would have been, I think, in the end of 2018. And she fell in her chambers one day, and she knew she'd broken some ribs because she'd had this happen once before. And she actually didn't even want to go to the hospital, but the pain was so excruciating that finally the cops took her to GW Hospital, and where they did an X-ray, and it showed what looked like a mass on her lung. And I didn't know any of this, but she called David, my husband, and he arranged for a biopsy to be done at the hospital where he was vice chairman of surgery, Fairfax Hospital. And they did a biopsy there, and it showed that she had a small cancerous nodule on one lung. And that was in November, and in the next 6 weeks or so, she decided that she likely would have the surgery done where her daughter wanted her to have it, which was at Sloan Kettering. Now, at that time, the book On the Basis of Sex was coming out, and I did a whole slug of interviews with her, including 3 in New York in 1 week. And one of them, actually, which was an hour long, was not about the movie, but had been organized before. And in the last one of these interviews, I looked at her. It was after one at Lincoln Center, at dinner. And there was a dinner, and then I did this little interview of her, and she looked so tired, I cut it short. And we had one more to do, and the next day my husband said to me, I have to go do something or other today with Ruth. It's nothing major. And proving that, I am a trained observer, I said, okay, fine, I'll go spend some time with my sister. And he went off. I didn't know anything. She had surgery that Friday for removal of part of her lung. And that's what he was with her at Sloan Kettering, meeting with everybody to what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, how they were going to handle everything. And he didn't tell me anything. Of course, he is a HIPAA Nazi. There is that too. So, but the night of the surgery, he figured that if he wanted to stay married to me, he better tell me. So he sat me down that night, told me that she was being operated on the next morning in New York. And I waited for the press release. When the press release came out, I had a list of names from him of doctors I could call who were experts, and I did a story. And I was waiting to do a TV hit that night. And we were having a quick bite to eat, and my phone rang, and I answered it, and Ruth is on the other line. She's in the ICU. He tells me afterwards she had a chest tube in, and she says, "Nina, I'm sitting here having a far better consommé than I had any right to expect in a hospital. And I just wanted to tell you why I forbid David to tell you anything about this. I didn't want you to be trapped between your friendship for me and your obligations as a journalist." And I just, it says it all when a friend is thinking of you instead of herself when she's about to have her third cancer operation of her life. It says more than I could ever say in my own words about Ruth.
I want to talk about how you returned the friendship. I want to end with talking about the Supreme Court because I want people to leave, extremely depressed. Just like when they leave my class. But I want to talk about those last few dinners, some of those 23 dinners in a row where you said that your husband was the cook and you were the entertainment. And there was a line, and I just didn't expect this. You said that you would practice some of your jokes.
Well, I'm not the best joke teller. And he teases me about it. So I would try to think of some jokes to tell her because she was getting frailer, especially in the last few months. And I knew that the reason she was coming to us was because she trusted us, number one. She knew she would get an absolutely divine dinner, most of the time bouillabaisse. And at least one time out of 3, it would be bouillabaisse, because it was her favorite that he made. And she often had her daughter Jane with her or her granddaughter Clara. They would get tested, and then they would come and stay with her for a while, and they would come to dinner, and we would put her at the far end of the table. We put all the leaves in the table as if we were having a dinner for 12, and she and her contingent would be at one end, and we would be at the other end. And in the early days when we didn't know very much about this disease, we had an antiviral solution that we would mop down the bathroom, the kitchen, the everything. And so she trusted us. And so my job was to entertain her. Sometimes she would, the truth is that Ruth loved gossip. And every once in a while, she had great judicial gossip about the lower courts. She would say things like, "And I hear on the Sixth Circuit they're ready to kill each other." Now, I realize that for most people that's not great gossip, but for me that was very good gossip.
No, that's legitimately great gossip. Let's move to talking about the Supreme Court and actually 2 different confirmation hearings. And a lot of people here are, of course, aware of the fact that you were the one to break the story regarding Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment against now Justice Clarence Thomas. And what struck me was a couple of things, but she initially said, "I'll talk to you, but you cannot use my name." And you said, "I'm sorry, that's not how this can go." And could you kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and explain why it was so important to identify her?
There are journalists today who would do that story without a name, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't then, and I wouldn't now. You make a serious allegation about somebody that will destroy their lives potentially. You cannot do it anonymously. So she finally said that if I got a copy of the affidavit that she'd written for the FBI, she would talk to me. I think from reading her memoir that she thought I wouldn't be able to get that. But I did. So, and she lived up to her commitment, and we did a lengthy interview on the phone, and then I held the story actually for 24 hours trying to get to the then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Biden, to tell me why they weren't having a hearing about this, why this was not happening. And I never could get an answer, so I went ahead and aired the story. And I actually never met Anita Hill until last year, when I interviewed her last year about a book she had. And so it was very nice to finally meet her in the flesh. But when it came to the, I take it you're heading towards the Kavanaugh hearing.
Could I ask you one more Anita Hill related question before we get to the, because I think we all need a minute before we get to the Kavanaugh hearings. There was actually a special counsel that investigated the leak regarding
yeah, they
Anita
subpoenaed
Hill.
my phone records. They got them too, and I never knew that it was one of these subpoenas where they don't tell you until after the fact. And but they never they never were able to. I'm sure they had their suspicions, but they were never able to nail down what the identity of who had told me, or what individual or individuals had helped me with the story, and who had helped me get the affidavit. And it is indicative of the difficulty in leak investigations, and you should just keep that in mind when you note that the Supreme Court was unable to discover who was the source of the Dobbs leak.
I heard you say this well before the report came out.
Yes,
They're
I
not
said
gonna
they'll
know.
never find out. They'll never find out.
Not even when the person writes the book?
No, I don't think so. I think that this is the kind of secret people do hold. To this day, nobody knows who my sources were for the Anita Hill story, and it's a secret I'll take to my grave. I mean, I don't want to hurt the individual or individuals who helped me. And one of the interesting things was when the special counsel finally made his report, the astonishing thing to me was the number of people who actually knew about it. And there were like 100 of them. And most of them were not friends of Clarence Thomas. Some of them were at the White House. But most of the people who knew were the various interest groups who were afraid to, who all of whom were questioned under oath, and they just couldn't figure it out. And I think that's very much the case with the Dobbs leak. I don't think it's likely, certainly in the next 10 or 20 years, that we're going to know that. It's conceivable that someday it will, I don't know how many decades it was after Watergate that we learned who the source, who Deep Throat was. It was like 30 years or something, right? I mean, it was when Mark Felt died.
It might have been more than 30 years, actually. Yeah, that's right. We talked about this very briefly, but the leak investigation was not the only, investigation's the wrong word, but not the only time that federal law enforcement maybe opened up a folder on you. And
Oh, right.
I haven't heard you talk about this as much, but it's a great part of the book, and I'm just going to say the name and let you take it from there, J. Edgar Hoover.
So I had an assignment when I was in my late 20s, when I worked for the National Observer, to write a profile of J. Edgar Hoover. And they gave me a month to do it, and I did dozens of interviews. And it was a very good profile, if I do say so myself, and I think pretty well balanced. But he tried to have me fired. And he wrote a 4 or 5 page single-spaced letter accusing me of using faceless informers in my reporting, etc. And ultimately, after he died, I decided I really ought to find out what kind of a file he had on me, if he had a file. And I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And the Justice Department did not want to give me this file, even though they, I think, knew that they would ultimately lose in court. And so at one point, the FOIA guy at the Department of Justice invited me over to talk me out of continuing with my lawsuit. And he said, look, I'm going to show you something that you will not get no matter what, because it's attorney work product, and it's Justice Department work product, but I'm hoping when you see this that you'll give up this idea. I don't know why on earth he shot that. So he shows me, in my youth, I had been trying to get J. Edgar to give me an interview, and I kept writing letters, and they kept being shoveled to him by his press guy. And this must have been the third or fourth letter that I had sent him. And he wrote across it, "She certainly is a persistent bitch," which I consider high praise for a reporter. That's what we're supposed to be.
That's a badge of honor.
Yeah.
I did say I want to talk about 2 confirmation hearings, and you said something about Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing, and I absolutely agree with this. Of course, people remember that Justice Kavanaugh was also accused of some misconduct, but when he was very young. And I say that because you wrote, I never completely understood why Kavanaugh didn't say, I have no idea if I did anything, but if I did, I'm horrified. And then you add, instead, he blew his stack in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I remember I was on a local TV set at the time, and I saw that, and I clerked for a federal judge who never wavered in his temperament. And I said, oh, it's over for him. And of course, I was absolutely wrong. Did you have the sense of he's calling his confirmation into question, or was it clear that he could blow his stack and still become a Supreme Court justice?
Clarence Thomas blew his stack too.
Yeah.
And he was confirmed. So when people said, oh, it's over, after the Christine Blasey Ford testimony, and even after Kavanaugh lost his temper, I did not think it was over. These are not real hearings. These are, these days, the confirmation process is totally broken. And the Republicans had the votes. It's just that simple. And it was not going to change anything. It didn't matter that there was going to be an additional request to the FBI. The FBI only goes as far as it's told to go, and it's told to go as far as the Justice Department tells it to go. And this says nothing about the merits of the charges or lack of merit of the charges against Brett Kavanaugh. But if you really want to find out ahead of time, if you want to find out if there are any skeletons in the closet of a nominee to the Supreme Court, then the Judiciary Committee, on a bipartisan basis, has to do some of its own investigating. And it doesn't do it after the fact. It has to do it before the fact. And there are plenty of times with nominees to cabinet positions and even a few lower court positions where nominations have been withdrawn because information is secured before there is a big public hearing. And that is the only way to assure that somebody is not wrongly accused and at the same time properly investigated. And now the process is so politicized because I don't think at this point that either side tells the other side what they're doing at all. There is no bipartisanship even in what time or when there are going to be hearings. So what would make us think there's going to be bipartisanship in actually having a quiet investigation where you take people's depositions under oath and see if you think there's a there. It's not a good way to do business, but it happens to be the world we live in.
I think we're getting close to the time when I need to turn it over to Q&A. I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned throughout the book about the Supreme Court justices and their life experience and how much that affects their decision making. And you had one story about Justice Powell and reproductive choice and some other stories. But are there examples where you still see it, where you think this decision is because they know their niece, fill in the blank, or they know their law clerk, fill in the blank, where it seems to me that they really do make different decisions based on what they have themselves experienced? I'm thinking of a very kind of simple case in a way dealing with privacy rights and cell phones, where they all came out a certain way because they all have cell phones in their pockets.
So, and they all have cell phones in their pockets. Not only that, but Walter Dellinger, when that first cell phone case came up, was the Solicitor General, and he heard a piece I had on that morning where somebody I had interviewed said, I wonder how they'd feel about turning over their cell phones. And so he put it into his oral argument, just in case they weren't avid listeners to NPR. And I think that made all the difference in the world. And I just, this is a court that is more conservative than any court probably since the early 1930s. It is a court that for the first time since I've been covering the court, which is since 1968, when I first started covering the court at all, that has no center. It has 6 conservatives, 3 liberals. On the big cases, most of them are 6-3 or 5-4. On the rare occasion where the Chief Justice or Justice Gorsuch in some cases flakes off, but rarely together. And so my experience has always been that the court was a place of, even though certainly they got angry from time to time with each other, it was an exploration and an attempt to reach some consensus as much as possible. And the center did dominate most of the time. Whither the center went was where the court went. And that isn't the case anymore. And so, in a sense, this is an experience like I've never had before. The only insight I can give you is that not only is there great, I think, unhappiness between the court's liberals and conservatives, but among some of the conservatives too. I think it's very clear they don't particularly like each other or trust each other. And the Dobbs case was the ultimate proof of that. I mean, I think among the press corps anyway, there's very little doubt about not who the leak was from, but why the leak was. It was from somebody on the right who wanted to freeze the status quo in February. Normally, cases go through 10 and as many as 20 or more drafts after the first draft. This was the first draft in February, and it didn't change one whit. Hardly a word was changed, and it achieved what it wanted, which was to preserve the status quo, which was with 5 justices in the majority and the Chief Justice concurring, And I think that he, at that point in February and all the way up until May, was still trying to get Kavanaugh to join him in upholding the Mississippi law banning abortions after 15 weeks, but not overturning Roe. And that leak in May ended any prospects of that happening.
Do you want to do Q&A before our Grammy fashion review? Should we go straight to that, I think?
Sure.
I'm looking at your watch, and I have a feeling I've already overstayed my welcome here. So I think, Andrea, do we need to open it up? Okay. Okay. Okay.
I don't have any Grammy info, really.
We were just going to do the walk-in, and you and I were going to review the fashions. I don't know if they told you about that.
So please use the mics at the front.
Alex Michelson, star of Screen here in Los Angeles, a reporter and anchor at Fox 11.
Thank you very
Nina
much.
Totenberg.
Hi there.
Hi.
It's a great honor to meet you. Thank you for the inspiration. As a journalist myself, you've been so inspiring to so many of us, and thank you for what you do. I have the question I was going to ask, and then I want to ask a follow-up of something you just said because it was interesting. But the question I was going to ask is on the concept of friendships. You talked about how important it is for you to be fair. I'm wondering if you have any experiences where other people you've covered were sort of frustrated by what you said about them, and they thought, hey, weren't we friends? How did that happen? Like, has that created any issues? And then the follow-up of something you just said that was juicy, because I like gossip too. You just suggested that folks on the right don't like each other on the court. Is there any gossip on who doesn't like each other, or can you take us behind the scenes?
Well, I think it's. Let me take the last part first. You know, I think it's pretty obvious that Justice Gorsuch rubs people the wrong way. I think that there is an enormous contentiousness among the conservatives as to whose ideas should prevail. Yes, they're all see themselves as originalists and textualists, but that doesn't mean they see each case the same way, and they're prima donnas. They want to be the most important person. They want to be the, you know, I guess one should say this, the chief among Indians. But several of them have made rather clear that their distaste for the actual Chief Justice. They don't like the fact that he actually, until now, has been able to sort of, that he holds on to the court and views it as part of his duty to try to defend its institutional sense. It's no accident that when Justice Thomas gave a speech after the Dobbs leak, he said he didn't trust anybody on the court anymore, and he said he had loved Justice Ginsburg. He didn't agree with her, but that they had a very collegial relationship, and he loved Chief Justice Rehnquist. He did not say a word about Roberts. Alito occasionally will roll his eyes when his liberal colleagues ask questions, and even when his conservative colleagues ask questions. And there is at least a theory, I'm not sure it's correct, that Alito thought he should have been chief and Roberts been the associate justice. They were nominated within very close time, because what happened was that Justice O'Connor announced her retirement, and then unexpectedly, Chief Justice Rehnquist died. So they went ahead with President Bush then changed the Roberts nomination to replace O'Connor to becoming Chief Justice, and then named Alito shortly thereafter to be Associate Justice. And there is a theory, at least, that Alito thinks he would be a far better chief, and that Roberts is a thorn in his side. I'll say one other thing. the joke that I think one of the scholars on strict scrutiny said, I think it was Leah Littman, called this the YOLO court. You only live once. That is, this court is grabbing cases so fast, trying to get done what has been the conservative agenda for a long time. And it's made my beat, people say, how can you cover this court? What do you mean, how can I cover this court? This is a great story. For a journalist, this is a great story. But they are not loath to chew up their currency, so to speak. They don't seem to be worried about that. So I don't remember what your other question was.
Oh, it was just about people that maybe you have a friendly relationship with them, and then you cover them, then they get frustrated.
I would say no. I'm sure there have been people who've been ticked off at me for something I said wrong, but most of the time, I would say the few times that people have actually said to me, you should have called me, you didn't call me, you used my name, you should have called me. I don't ever do this anymore, but I did it a couple of times when I was younger, and they were right. I should have called them. I apologized. I offered to actually say something about it, to put it into a correction on the air. And in both cases that I can think of, both of them said to me, just, that would only make it worse. Just don't do that again. And I learned a lesson from it.
Thank you, Alex.
May I use this one too? Everybody in this room is so honored to be here. I walked out on a brother I haven't seen in 3.5 years because no one is going to miss Nina Totenberg after living in D.C. for I don't know how many years. I hope this is not an unfair question. It almost ruined my relationship with my son at the time. Did friends of Justice Ginsburg during the Obama administration try to convince someone who was a fabulous, fabulous human being and a great jurist that her time was up and that maybe this was in history?
So I know what this question is, and I will answer it for you. And there's a multifaceted answer. I think this was either 2013 or 14, I'm not sure which. President Obama invited Justice Ginsburg for lunch and suggested to her that she should think about retiring because this was the last moment that he thought he might get somebody through to replace her. And she didn't do it. And it's a fair question. Did she make a mistake? I mean, I'm sure if she had lived it over again, she might have done differently. But at the time, she was at the top of her game. She was having a very good time on the court. She was winning cases nobody thought could be won, and she was probably right that other people might not have been able to win them. And I think that she thought, remember there was a filibuster still for Supreme Court nominees, and I think that she thought that as long as there was a filibuster, and there was a very close margin in the Senate, that anybody that Obama would name that she would think could fill her shoes would not get confirmed. And at the same time, she really thought, as I suspect many people did, that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. And she wanted to give the first woman president a chance to name her replacement. And, she rolled the dice, and she was wrong. And I'm absolutely morally certain you cannot imagine the things that she put up with in that last year of her life trying to last past the election. And she came very close, but she didn't quite make it. And I think that's all because she fully understood. She never anticipated, she not only never figured that Mrs. Clinton wouldn't win, she never imagined that somebody like Donald Trump would be president either. And so I think the combination of all of those things, Supreme Court justices tend to think they know something about politics. They actually don't. And so I think they always view politics as a more benign circumstance than it is. And as I said, I think she'd own up to it if she were here.
Thank you.
Can I, while we're waiting for the next question, follow up on that, which was, I always had the feeling that maybe when you've been told your entire life, as you said in the beginning, that you're an outsider, hey, let me in, let me part of this room. She's in the most powerful room, arguably, in the country. It's very difficult to give that up voluntarily when you've been told your entire life you don't have a seat at this table.
Well, I think that's probably true, but I do think that she didn't think that her view of the political situation was that with a filibuster, anybody that she would think of as a grand replacement would get blocked, and then they'd be out of time. And that actually isn't a crazy idea. Subsequently, in 2016, Mitch McConnell held up, the Garland nomination and didn't even give him a hearing for 10 months. So it wasn't, Republicans were always much more ferocious about judicial nominations than Democrats were. And I think she thought it was not in the cards. What she didn't see as being in the cards was that she would get sick exactly in the wrong moment.
Yeah. 3 more questions? Okay.
Samaya, I think very nice to meet you. This is very exciting. When you finally got your FOIA request from the government, were there any surprises in it, or anything you can share with us other than it was benign?
Well, the only real surprise was had been blank pages when I subpoenaed when I filed the request. They gave me in the first cut. They gave me all the letters to the editor that had been written complaining about my profile of which we printed. We printed a full page of those, so I already had those. And in the second, then when I appealed, I got more material, but it was all blank pages. It was all virtually blank pages, and I wanted to know what was in those blank pages. And the one that had me most concerned was a line that said, blank called to report blank, but because of what she's written about you, and then there was a blank page. And I thought, what is this? So it turned out what it was that there was a freelance photographer who had been hired by the American Bar Association to take photographs for the Gavel Awards, and I won a Gavel Award. And the Chief Justice, the Chief Justice was Warren Berger, gave me my Gavel Award, and there was a picture taken. And so I asked the ABA if I could have the photograph, and the ABA was told that the photograph hadn't turned out. Well, it turned out that the freelance photographer was an informant for the Bureau, and he wrote in kissing up to Hoover, he wrote, but because of what she's written about her, I told them that the photograph didn't turn out. And and it went on and on and on like this. But I finally understood why I didn't have a picture of me and Berger. It was mainly garbage, but it was worth still doing.
It was a blank and good story. Okay.
Hello. I'm not sure how many of us are here today, but do you have any advice for aspiring journalists and female journalists?
I can't hear you with your
Any
mask
advice for aspiring journalists and
Yes.
female journalists?
Yes.
Well, it used to be about 7 or 8 years ago that I simply discouraged people from journalism for the simple reason that that newspapers were disappearing and television has become more and more limited in what it does, and I didn't think I couldn't see an easy path for a lot of people to make a living wage doing this work. And fortunately, that's no longer true, largely because of podcasts, and there are lots more venues for journalists online than there used to be. The very sad thing is that there aren't in local journalism, and that's the most important journalism in some ways that there is, because if ever there's a place where you need a watchdog, at the school committee, at the city council, at the everything, it's in local journalism. And it's one thing in Los Angeles, at least you have one good newspaper, but most places in America have no more newspapers. There are newspaper deserts across the country. And that is very dangerous business, I think. So if I had to tell a young journalist what to do, it would be to find a place where you can do local journalism, hopefully in print, but if necessary, on TV. It's harder because if it bleeds, it leads. And it's harder to get real journalism on TV, but it's not impossible. So that's what I would tell young journalists, and hope that at some point we'll get back to having some way of having journalism that is a watchdog for local governments.
Thank you.
Last question, and then Nina's going to sing us out.
Thank you for the time and thoughts. My question is really referencing your comments on the broken judicial appointment process right now. And it's really sort of two parts of what do you think the powers that be need to be doing differently to try and fix this, or maybe put on your benevolent dictator hat to say how you would fix this? And two, for those of us in the audience, are there steps or things we can be doing more, better, different to try and help drive that change?
Because judicial appointments particularly have become so politicized, it's very difficult for me to see a way to fix this. And the only way would be, this may not be particularly popular in this venue, but as long as the extremes on the right and the left are what dominates when there's a primary, it means that there is no center in Congress either that is able to dominate for long. And that means that you can't come to the table easily and come up with solutions for problems. And I'm not sure that under any circumstances you could fix the confirmation process, but there are other areas where you could. But my job really isn't, as much as I would like to be able to give you an easy solution, A, I don't have one, and B, that's not my job.
I think we're going to...
Let's talk about the Grammys.
You've been incredibly generous with your time, and I think we're going to end with you reading the last part of the epilogue from the book, if that's okay with you. And I think it's a wonderful note to end on.
Thank you.
Got it.
I still wake up many mornings thinking of Ruth, and also Cokie, and sometimes Nino and Lewis Powell and Bill Brennan too. I've been so fortunate to have them all and many more as friends. For the ones who are gone, I often wonder what they would have to say about the current state of the world. Yet I'm struck by the fact that no matter their origins or paths in life, all of them shared a common trait: optimism. Today's events at home and abroad would surely test that optimism, But while I think each of them would be realistic about the challenges we face, they would all be determined to persevere. As Ruth often said, my story is hopeful. So I will be too. I'm not hanging up my spurs anytime soon. As my mother used to tell me, I'll see you on the radio.